God has many attributes, but one attribute stands out and is repeated over and over again in the scriptures, and that is the merciful nature of God. In this series on mercy, I will share with you my reflections on God's loving mercy from the perspective of the Jewish culture to the impact of the Babylonian exile on Israel, down to the Gospel of St. Luke, the evangelist to the Gentiles. Welcome to the podcast series on God's mercy. Mary is one of the best examples of the people in the New Testament who received God's mercy. She has proclaimed this in her Magnificat by saying that God's mercy is on those who fear the Lord, those who acknowledges His power and wisdom, and that His mercy remains for generations and generations to follow. She also said in the same canticle of thanksgiving that God has helped Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as He promised. Mary declares to us that God is so merciful, He will not abandon us and will keep His promise of salvation to us, we, the descendants of Abraham, through faith. She reminds us that God's mercy is ever present throughout the entire history of mankind. How beautiful is Mary's depiction of God's mercy. For Mary, God's mercy is something that does not only transcend time, it is also something that is in the very intention of God from the very beginning and will even see through its fulfillment up to the end. For Mary, God's mercy is constant, unmoved, ever present, just like God Himself. Today we celebrate the feast of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, one of the important Marian dogmas taught by the Catholic Church. It explains that Mary was conceived in the womb of her mother, Saint Anne, without the trace of original sin, something that every human being is born with, a kind of brokenness in the human heart, disabling us to fully walk with God and remain in His grace. Mary was born without this brokenness. The angel Gabriel said this himself when he greeted Mary, "Hail, Mary, full of grace." Mary was rendered able to walk in God's grace because of her special role in the bringing forth of Jesus Christ into the world. Mary received the first fruits of salvation from the moment of her conception. What an incredible gift of mercy! And she did nothing to deserve this gift. She said so herself in her Magnificat. It was all the work of God. It was God's grace that she was able always to say yes to God's will. God's intention of salvation for mankind, as well as its fulfillment, comes into full circle in Mary's conception and in her yes to His will, the same way that God's plan for salvation came into full circle in the promise of a Savior and in Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. Mary received God's mercy. She was filled with God's grace. And anyone who received God's mercy is not centered on oneself, but on God, giving God all the credit and not to oneself. And just like what the Blessed Marie Eugene of the Child Jesus said about Mary, she is like a clean mirror that bounces off God's light to all mankind, not keeping any to herself. Happy Feast of the Immaculate Conception of Mary.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is a personal initiative of mine in my desire to bring God wherever His people are. I believe that the more we talk about God, the more we bring Him into our consciousness, the more we are reminded that He is real and He is ever close to each one of us. My prayer is that you discover Him personally, by yourself, and see that what He wants is nothing but happiness for you. God bless us all. Shout out to all our listeners from the US, particularly from Ohio, Washington, Texas, and New Jersey, and from Hessen and Thüringen, Germany, and of course, the Philippines. Thank you for your support. Dankeschön. Maraming salamat po.